Okay, the microphone was not on, so I have to start all over again. Welcome to our discussion of Rabbi Schneur Zalman of Liadi, known as the Alter Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe. He was the founder of the Chabad branch of the Chassidic movement, founded by the Baal Shem Tov, Rabbi Israel Baal Shem Tov, who was born in 1698 and passed away in 1760. So the Baal Shem Tov started a revolutionary movement to bring joy, to bring life to the Jewish community that was in a very sad state. And the Baal Shem Tov appealed mostly, and I underline the word mostly, to the simple folk, people who were downtrodden, people who were considered to be inferior by the scholars, by some of the arrogant scholars, and they were so downtrodden, so defeated, that this was a threat to the very stability of the Jewish people in Eastern Europe at that time. So the Baal Shem Tov appealed mostly to the simple people, although his disciples were among the greatest of scholars. So he did appeal to the scholars who became his close disciples, but the mass of Eastern European Jews were not scholars. They were impoverished by virtue of the pogroms of the 17th century, terrible massacres of 1648 and 1649, and then the false messianic arrival of Shabtai Tzvi, which disillusioned so many people. Jews were crushed, and the Baal Shem Tov awakened them and rejuvenated them and brought them back to life. The Baal Shem Tov passed away, as I said, in 1760 and was succeeded by his greatest disciple, Rabbi Dov Ber, known as the Maggid of Mezrich. Maggid simply means the preacher. He was hired to speak to the people, and he lived for a good part of his leadership life in the city of Mezrich, which is now in the Ukraine. He passed away actually in another city, in Anipoli. But at any rate, the Maggid of Mezrich broadened the Chassidic movement, spread out throughout the entire Europe, except for Western Europe, Germany, France, it didn't reach there, but it reached Lithuania, it reached White Russia, it reached Poland, of course, and Hungary, the Carpathian Mountain area, and it really strengthened the Chassidic movement. The Maggid of Mezrich was known as a tremendous organizer. He was extremely organized, and he was able to structure the Chassidic movement to reach to each geographic area based on the needs of that area. When he passed away, the Chassidic movement branched into many different branches by design. It wasn't a dispute. People broke away, and this happens very often also, that there's always a breakaway. There's a synagogue that you go to, and the synagogue you don't step foot in. So you have to always have two. But this was not a breakaway. The Maggid of Mezrich designed this, that each area of Europe should have a Chassidic leader who was fit, who was appropriate for that area. And that's where Rabbi Schneur Zalman comes into the picture. He was chosen to be the leader in White Russia, Belarus, and Lithuania, the stronghold of the opposition to the Chassidic movement. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's start off with his birth. First, he had to be born. He was born in 1745. His parents were hidden followers of the Baal Shem Tov. His father was a very great scholar and a very saintly person who hated any type of recognition. He was one of those hidden tzaddikim, hidden saintly people who did not want anyone to know about him. And he became a follower of the Baal Shem Tov. And the Baal Shem Tov told him that when his son was born, he should name him Schneur. Schneur means two lights. He will illuminate the world with two lights, the light of the revealed parts of Torah, the laws, the Talmudic teachings of Torah, and he will also illuminate the world with the spiritual, mystical teachings of the Torah. But the Baal Shem Tov told his disciple, Rabbi Baruch was the name of Rabbi Schneur Zalman's father, don't tell him about me. I don't want you to tell him that you are a disciple of myself, the Baal Shem Tov, let him find his own way. And that's the hallmark of the Chabad philosophy that differentiates it from other Chassidic movements in terms of its ideology, that the focus has to be not on someone feeding you, like an infant is fed by his mother, in the same way great rabbis could feed their disciples. You have to do it on your own. Yes, there's always help, there's always inspiration, but the hallmark of the Chabad movement's philosophy was you have to reach whatever level of spirituality you reach with your own effort. The Baal Shem Tov also told Rabbi Baruch, Rabbi Schneur Zalman's father, that your son is going to have a new soul. And there's a lot of discussion what he meant by a new soul. One simple meaning is most souls are recycled. Most souls are reincarnated. So the assumption is that if we're here today, our souls were here once before or twice or maybe more than that before. But there always are unique souls that are one in a million that come into this world because they have some new vitality, a new energy that will change the very landscape of the world. Whatever the explanation is, it's a unique title to say that someone is going to have a new soul. And Rabbi Schneur Zalman was a child prodigy. When he was 8 years old, he composed a commentary on the Torah, combining the three major biblical commentators, Rashi, Ibn Ezra, and Nachmanides. And he put them all together. And there's a whole story about it, which I won't go into. That just shows you at the age of 8, he was already a scholar. He was well-versed in mathematics and astronomy, in addition, of course, to all the Jewish subjects. At the age of 15, he got married. Now that 15 is a child. No, in those days, 15 are more mature than 50-year-olds these days. They were very mature, but he was a towering scholar. He can probably put most scholars today to shame at the age of 15. At the age of 18, he had mastered all of Jewish knowledge that was available then, Talmud and all of its commentaries, and he was also steeped in the teachings of Kabbalah. This is at the age of 18. At the age of 20, he said, I am at a crossroads in my life. There are two centers of Jewish knowledge, Jewish activity. One center was in Vilna, the capital of Lithuania. That's where the great Rabbi Elijah of Vilna, the Gaon of Vilna, he's known. He was known as the greatest scholar of his time. And many say he was the greatest of many generations and centuries before and after him. And that was the center of scholarship in Europe at that time. Mezrich, which was in the Ukraine, was known for its emphasis on prayer. Although the Maggid of Mezrich was also a phenomenal scholar. But the focus was on prayer, on the spirituality that you experience during prayer. And Rabbi Schneur Zalman said to himself, and of course he reported this, that we know about this because he told others about it, I already know how to learn a little, but I don't know how to pray. Now, of course, he didn't mean it in this literal sense of the word. He was a man that was a spiritual giant who prayed with the deepest feelings and concentration, but he felt that his fulfillment of prayer was far, far less advanced than his fulfillment of his quest for knowledge. In his own, the Chassidim believe that he was a match for Elijah of Vilna, and maybe even a greater scholar. But when it came to prayer, he felt that's where he had to go. So he traveled to Mezrich. He got his wife's permission. That was a very important detail. His brother tagged along with him, and the wagon broke down. And the Alter Rebbe said to his brother, did you get permission from your wife to go on this trip? And he said, no. He says, go right back. So his brother never studied under the Maggid of Mezrich, but he became a disciple of Rabbi Schneur Zalman. He became one of his most trusted disciples. His name was Yehuda Leib, by the way. At any rate, the young scholar in his early 20s was asked by his teacher, his master, Rabbi Dov Ber, it's about time that a revised version of the Code of Jewish Law be put into writing. See, the Code of Jewish Law was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo over 400 years ago. And since he wrote it, immediately after he wrote the Code of Jewish Law, dozens of commentaries started to add clarity, disagreements, bring up new situations, and learning Jewish law became a little bit more challenging because there were so many super commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. And there's so many different customs depending on where you come from. If you come from Lithuania, you have these customs, you follow these opinions. So the Maggid of Mizrich gave him the responsibility to rewrite the Code of Jewish Law. And he did in his 20s. Most of it he wrote in his youth. And it became a major classic of Jewish law to this day. So that was when he was in his 20s. But he didn't have an easy life. He had opposition from his own father-in-law. His father-in-law, when he discovered that his son-in-law became a Chassid, you have to realize in those days the opposition to the Chassidic movement was no less than the opposition to Maimonides. And if we're looking for parallels between the two, that's one of the parallels. They both encountered tremendous opposition to the extent that his father-in-law, who was a respected member of the community, demanded that he give his daughter, that Rabbi Schneur Zalman give his wife, this man's daughter, a get, a divorce. And she refused, to her credit, of course. But the father-in-law persecuted his son-in-law. The story is told that one Friday night, the Alter Rebbe would pray for hours. When he came home, and he didn't have a big house, he had one big room or so, he discovered that his father-in-law took all the food out of the room and all the drink. There was no wine, there was nothing. And he's supposed to make Kiddush Friday night and eat a meal. Well, he didn't have a meal. So he found some vodka. And he didn't even have a cup. He took a big bowl and he drank the bowl of vodka. And his father-in-law expected to find him drunk. And instead of being drunk, he was up all night studying Talmud. So this is just one little illustration of the opposition that he encountered from his own father-in-law. But that was nothing compared to the opposition he encountered from what the self-proclaimed misnagdim. Misnagid means opponents, adversaries. They call themselves adversaries, and they call the Chassidim the pious ones. Interesting way of opposing someone, to use the name opponent to yourself and call your enemy the pious ones. But anyhow, that's the way it worked out. But the more they would oppose the Chassidic movement, the faster it grew. There's no real figures to tell you how many Chassidim there were in the world and how many Rabbi Schneur Zalman have. The estimation is that when he passed away, he had over 100,000 followers in all of Belarus, Ukraine, and Lithuania. So the more they were opposed, the stronger the movement became. Now, why were they opposed? I'm not going to go into a whole discussion of that, but there were several reasons why they were opposed. Number one, this is soon after the false messiah, Shabbatai Tzvi, who used mysticism as his basis for his claims of messianic claims. So people were wary, and that wasn't the only movement. There was another Frankist movement, but any movement that started to use mysticism and were a new movement were aroused suspicion. Is this a breakaway movement from Judaism? That was a legitimate concern that great rabbis had. Then there were some ideological differences, which I can't go into right now because it'll take us too long. But there were some ideological differences on how to interpret different teachings of Kabbalah, of the Ari. The Arizal, who lived 400 plus years ago, was the greatest Kabbalist of all times, and there were some disputes about how to interpret his teachings. So those were legitimate ideological disputes, and Judaism never feared disputes, arguments. We always argue, and that's a positive thing about Jews. We argue, but we get along. We have differences of opinion, but we don't hate each other, ideally, of course. It doesn't always work out that way, but that's the way it should be ideally. So there were some ideological differences. There were some suspicions of Shabtai Tzvi, that this might be the followers, secret followers. And then there was some political issues. They were afraid, some of the people in the opponent, the adversary community were afraid that the Chassidim were going to become very powerful. They were a growing movement. So there were some political differences. People were afraid of losing their positions. And then there was another element. This was at the same time the Haskallah Movement started. Haskallah Movement was the Jewish version of Enlightenment, so-called Enlightenment, where Jews started to secularize Judaism and throw out all the spirituality of Judaism, denied the belief in God, denied belief in the Mashiach, denied the belief in the soul, and all these spiritual things. This is what the Haskallah Movement was advocating. And they realized that the only way they could change the Jewish people from their backward ways, from the Dark Ages, which is what they said, of course, is by bringing a wedge, driving a wedge between the so-called traditional Jews. So how do you drive a wedge? You create a split between the Chassidim and the non-Chassidim, which was very successful. It didn't stop the Chassidic movement from growing, but it almost worked. All of these different factors together. Now, in 1772, just a few years before the United States declared independence, the Vilna Gaon signed a ban against the Chassidim, a ban which meant you have to persecute them, you have to oppress them. Now, many people say that the Vilna Gaon lived in a very cloistered life. He didn't really know what was going on in the outside world. He was just told things by certain troublemakers who wanted to create this schism between the Chassidim and the others. We have that same phenomenon even today in Israel. There are some very prominent great rabbis who are in their 90s, who don't really know what's going on in the outside world, but they're told by various people, and sometimes these people have agendas. So they get these great rabbis to sign on to whatever their agenda is, not really knowing all the details and all the facts. And it's a very painful thing, because these are really very special people. These are not bad people, these rabbis. And they're great scholars. But nevertheless, they are not always informed properly. And that's what happened with the Gaon of Vilna. So he signed on to this ban, which was a very, very hostile move against the Chassidim. And the Chassidim were being persecuted and oppressed. They were driven out of their synagogues. Their jobs, they lost their jobs. It was a very, very ugly type of opposition. Now, in 1772, that same year, the Maggid of Mezrich passed away. There's a sad story about his passing. Before his passing, in response to the ban against the Chassidim, some Chassidic leaders wanted to put on a counter ban against the opponents. And the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Schneur Zalman, was against it. He says, we don't fight with the same tactics that they use. But the other Chassidic leaders couldn't take the persecution, so they enacted the ban. And when the Maggid of Mezrich heard that, apparently he was very much opposed to that as well. He says, you lost, he intimated that he would pass away because of that counter ban. And he said to Reb Schneur Zalman, you sensed something that no one else sensed. Rabbi Schneur Zalman felt that the counter ban would cause problems for the Maggid of Mezrich, and he would pass away as a result. And he passed away a few months later after that ban was counterbanned. Rabbi Schneur Zalman, after his teacher, his master, passed away, started a new system of spreading Chassidic teachings, because his job, he was allocated to be the teacher and the master in the area of the opposition, the area of scholarship. Most of the Jews who lived in Ukraine, who lived in Poland, were simple Jews. There were great scholars there, but most of the people were simple. But the Lithuanian Jews, those were the elite, those were the scholars, and that's where the opposition came from. And Rabbi Schneur Zalman was given the mission to be in the lion's den, so to speak, and to attract adherents to the Chassidic movement, which he did, and he was very successful at that. And the opposition grew even more and more because of that. The more successful he was, the greater the opposition, to the point that he thought, I have to do something to quell the opposition, because it was getting very, very painful and destructive and ugly. So he went with a colleague of his. Actually, he was half teacher, half colleague, Rabbi Mendel of Vitebsk. Those who are familiar with Belarus know the city of Vitebsk. And there's a town near Vitebsk called Haradok. So he was in both places. He's known as Mendel of Vitebsk and Mendel of Haradok, who was Reb Schneur Zalman's senior colleague and partial mentor. Both of them decided, we're going to go to the Gaon of Vilna and we're going to debate with him. And at the end of that debate, you'll see that we'll make peace between the Chassidim and the Misnagdim. The problem was the Gaon of Vilna did not open the door to see them. There are different versions of the story, but everyone agrees that he left. Some say he left out of a window, so he shouldn't have to confront them. He had heard so many negative things that he did not even want to meet with them. That was such a sad thing, because had they met, they would have probably disagreed, but they would have disagreed amicably, and the band would have been withdrawn, and there would have been peace. But that's the way of life. That's life. In 1778, they issued another ban against the Chassidim. And this ban was even worse than the first one. Now, in 1796, Reb Schneur Zalman published his magnum opus, his most important work. It's his smallest work, or one of the smallest, but it's his most important one, known as the Tanya. The Tanya is called the Book of the Intermediates. It's a book that tells us how to win the struggles in our lives, how to reach the level of being able to be in control of your life. And in this book, he presents the primary fundamental teachings of Chassidus, dealing with God's unity. What do we mean when we say in the Shema, God is one? Are we just negating idol worship? No, we're more sophisticated than that. We don't have to tell ourselves every day, we don't believe in Zeus, we don't believe in Jupiter, we don't believe in all these idols. Why would we have to do this every day? We affirm God is one, that to mean that there is nothing else but God. Everything is a manifestation of God. And that's one of the foundations of Chabad Chassidic philosophy. And it's the first systematic work of Chassidic teachings. You see, there were a lot of Chassidic books published that were more like commentaries on the Torah, giving different parts of the Torah a Chassidic flavor. But this is the first and really the only real systematic work of Jewish philosophy. It's a fusion of philosophy, mysticism, and psychology all in one. And it was a guide for the perplexed. But the perplexed of the Alter Rebbe's period were not the same perplexed Jews of Maimonides' era. Maimonides' perplexed were Jews who couldn't reconcile in their own minds the conflicts between Greek philosophy and Judaism. They had a problem. To them, Judaism was not logical as Greek philosophy was. And Maimonides had to show them that Judaism was logical. That's the type of perplexed that lived then. In Rabbi Schneur Zalman's life, the perplexed didn't care about Aristotle. They could care less about Plato and Socrates. They could care less about Greek logic. They believed in the Torah. Their perplexion, what they were perplexed about was, am I able to live my life fully in tune with God's will when I have evil inclination? I have desires that are incompatible with God's will. How do I grow in my Judaism? How do I develop a relationship with God? And they had a lot of questions, a lot of spiritual questions, and they would come to Reb Schneur Zalman, and he was their counselor. And then he had so many followers, he says, I can't handle all these people. So he wrote down all of his answers in a book form, and that became the Tanya. But he never published the Tanya at first. First, the Tanya was handwritten, and copies were just written. Everyone would just copy it from another copy, until such time when he realized that if he doesn't publish it, something terrible will happen. Because what the opponents did is to take a copy of his Tanya and rewrite it and insert certain things that he never wrote that were very anti-traditional Judaism. And this is what they showed the Vilna Gaon and others. Look what this man is writing. This is heresy. So how do we know this story? Because one of his Chassidim was once in a town, and there was a man there with a table selling copies of the Tanya, handwritten copies. So he picked up, and this man the Chassid was a rich man. He picked up one of the copies, and he saw how things were added in there that were obviously not there. So he said, "Can I buy all of your copies?" And he bought the entire load of copies, of the fraudulent copies, and he destroyed them. But when the Reb Schneur Zalman discovered what was going on, against his own interest, he was a very humble person. He had no plan of publishing anything. In fact, his Code of Jewish Law, he never published. It was published posthumously, except for one little section, which he published anonymously. So here's a man who was not interested in promoting himself, but he was interested in making sure that they don't distort, so he reluctantly had the Tanya published. To this day, there are about 7,000 different editions of the Tanya. The Rebbe wanted the Tanya should be printed in every city in the world, wherever there might be a Jew, to bring the holiness of the book to every part of the world. So there are about 7,000 editions by now. At any rate, Rabbi Schneur Zalman had the Tanya published, and that, of course, aroused even more opposition. The opposition became so intense. Oh, I forgot to mention a very important part. Rabbi Schneur Zalman's older colleague, Rabbi Mendel of Vitebsk, couldn't handle the opposition, and he went to Israel. He made Aliyah to Israel, together with a whole bunch of Chassidim, and Rabbi Schneur Zalman joined that group to go to Israel. But his mentor convinced him not to go with him, to stay in Europe, because the Jews need his leadership. And that's when he really became a leader totally in his own right. He was no longer dependent on his older colleague for guidance. So that was a very important thing, that the request was made of him. He had no pretenses. He never wanted to be a leader. This is the hallmark of great Jewish leaders. They don't choose to be leaders. Someone chooses it for them and imposes it on them, realizing that they have no other choice. So now, Rabbi Schneur Zalman is becoming very popular. The Tanya is spreading all over, and the enemies saw that we have to do something to stop this once and for all. And they're going to be using any tactic that they could possibly use, not stopping even with trying to have him killed. So they informed to the Tsar that Rabbi Schneur Zalman is a rebel. He's guilty of treason. He is setting himself up as a new Tsar. He's supporting the enemies of Russia. The Rabbi Schneur Zalman, and this is the connection to the point I made before, the Chassidim that went to Israel had no means to support themselves. Israel then was not what Israel is today. It's not even what Israel was 100 years ago. This is over 200 years ago. So they were penniless. They were destitute. Rabbi Schneur Zalman started a charitable fund called Kolel Chabad, supporting Jews in Israel. And that fund continued uninterrupted for 239 years, I think, until today. I was just in New York a few weeks ago to speak at their annual dinner, and the head of the Kolel Chabad said that their budget, the annual budget, what it is to help people, feed people in Israel and other things, their annual budget is close to $200 million. This is started close to 250 years ago by Rabbi Schneur Zalman. So Israel in those days was under Ottoman rule. The Turks and the Russians didn't exactly see eye to eye. So here they said, you see, he's supporting the Turks against the Tsar. And look what he's doing. He has all these tens of thousands of followers that are flocking to him. He's like a king. and therefore guilty of treason. So he was arrested and taken to Petersburg, the capital, in a black coach. It was reserved only for the most heinous criminals. And he was accused of treason, which was, of course, a capital crime. And after 53 days in prison, he was exonerated, only to be imprisoned again a few years later. But the second time was not as bad as the first time, and he got out, and the Chassidic movement was given a real boost because of this victory. Rabbi Schneur Zalman composed many other books. He wrote the Code of Jewish Law, revised edition, which was published posthumously. In his own lifetime, he published one little section called the Laws of Torah Study, which he published anonymously. He revised the Jewish Siddur, the prayer book. He took 60 different editions of the prayer book, and he sifted them to find the prayers that were most accurate grammatically, that conformed to Jewish law most meticulously, and were consistent with the mystical teachings of Kabbalah. He also wrote, as the Shulchan Aruch, as I said, the Code of Jewish Law. There are two books called Torah Or and Likutei Torah, are his discourses on the Torah. He didn't write them. These are things that he said. He spoke publicly, and his brother and his son and his sons and grandson and others put them into writing. And then there are about 20 other volumes of his discourses that were published in recent years, and then a few volumes of his letters. So he was an extremely prolific communicator through writing or through speech. The last challenge of his life was the Napoleonic War. See, most Jews were excited about Napoleon because he was going to give them freedom. Rabbi Schneur Zalman was one of the few Jewish leaders that were totally opposed to Napoleon. Rabbi Schneur Zalman considered him to be the most evil person in the world. Now, people are surprised when they hear this because he felt that Napoleon's ego was so great, and we all know what kind of ego he had, and his ego did him in, because if he wasn't so arrogant, he wouldn't have fought against Russia at that time. But Rabbi Schneur Zalman felt that if he takes over Russia, that would be the end of Judaism in Russia. The Jews would totally assimilate, and there would be no, and he knew that the Tsar was no good friend of the Jews. He had experiences with the Tsar. The Tsar was the one who ordered his incarceration. But nevertheless, he knew that under the Tsar, the Jews would not assimilate as quickly. It's only when the communists took over, that's what brought assimilation to the Jews in Russia. But under the Tsar, Jews still remained Jewish. If they had Napoleon, it would be that the Jews would suffer the same fate as the German Jews and the French Jews, who were emancipated, but they assimilated as well. I don't know how many, in the 19th century, there were tens of thousands of German Jews who converted to Christianity, not because they believed in it, but because this was to make them to be able to assimilate. So in his fleeing from Napoleon's armies, he fled for several months. He got sick and he passed away in 1812. In a little town called Piena, there was not even a Jewish community there. There was no cemetery. He had to be taken, I don't know how many days, until they got to a town called Hadich. Now they call it Gadich, I think, because in Russia they don't pronounce the H. The H is pronounced as a G. But in those days it was pronounced as an H, Hadich. And to this day there are thousands of people who come to his gravesite every year since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, as I mentioned before, Maimonides and Rabbi Schneur Zalman have many similarities. One similarity and differences as well. One similarity is the idea of fusing faith with intellect. Faith and intellect sound like opposites. You believe in something, but you don't necessarily understand it. You understand something, but you don't have to believe it if you understand. Maimonides and Rabbi Schneur Zalman both tried to fuse the two, but in opposite directions. Maimonides began with the premise, as most Jewish philosophers and most philosophers, is you start off with zero. You start off on the ground. Okay, what do we accept? And you try to prove logically, with logical arguments, what is right and what is wrong, what is true, what is not true. And then, when you finally come to an impasse, you say, well, I have no choice, I have to rely on faith. because there's a limit how far logic can go. But the philosopher starts off with a premise: I have to prove God's existence. I have to prove that the Torah is true. And through logic, they try to prove it. Whether you like the logic, you disagree with it, you can argue, but they use logic to reach a point, and then they rely on faith to go beyond the logic. Maimonides was a very, very faithful Jew. He believed in every word of the Torah. In fact, Maimonides says if someone denies even one word of the Torah, it's like he denies the entirety of Torah. And of course, he himself claimed he doesn't understand all of the Torah. But his premise is logic, and then after logic, you reach the level of faith. Reb Schneur Zalman came from the opposite direction, as do Chassidic teachings of all branches. We start off with faith, that God is beyond logic, and it's a given. We don't have to prove God's existence. We don't have to prove the Torah is true. But here's where Schneur Zalman disagreed with other Chassidic masters. They said, that's it. Stay with your faith and be a good Jew, believe in God, believe in the Torah, and fulfill the commandments, and that's fine. That's all you have to do. Rabbi Schneur Zalman says, no, that's not enough. You then have to introduce your faith into logic. You have to introduce the faith into the intellect, so that not only your faith is attached to God, you're attached to God with every part of your being. Because if your mind doesn't embrace something, that means God is there, but not in your mind. God is in your soul, where the faith comes from. That's the spring of faith, but he hasn't entered into your consciousness. That's not good enough. But other Hasidic groups felt that it's better not to tamper with the logic, because you may be pulled in other directions. Just remain with the faith. And Reb Schneur Zalman says, no, we have to bring faith into the logic. That's why he started the movement called Chabad. What does Chabad mean? There's no such word as Chabad. It's an acronym. Chachma, Bina, and Da'at. Wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. There are three intellectual powers that we have in our soul. And the idea is to take the spiritual knowledge, spiritual awareness or faith, and introduce it into those three levels of our intellect. So in that way, they were both similar. They both fused faith with logic, but in opposite directions. They both wrote classics of Jewish law and philosophy. You know, throughout history, most of the great rabbis were great in all areas of Jewish knowledge, but they didn't specialize in all areas. They specialized in one area. I mean, let's say Rashi. Rashi was clearly the greatest sage of the medieval period, rivaling Maimonides. We can't say who was greater. But Rashi was not a philosopher. Maybe he was a philosopher, but he didn't write philosophy. We don't have any philosophical books. Rashi didn't write other than his commentaries on the Tanakh and on the Talmud. And he also has a few other books of Jewish law, mostly written by his students. So no one is saying that he wasn't a great philosopher. We don't know, but he certainly didn't excel in that area. He didn't specialize in that area. And we can go down the list of many of the most prominent sages who were towering intellects, specialized in one area or the other. Maimonides was equally great in Talmud, in Jewish law, and in philosophy. And he was a trailblazer. He was a genius in both areas. And if he was only famous in one area, he would have already been considered one of the greatest luminaries of all time. Same thing with Reb Schneur Zalman. He was not just great in one area, or great in all the areas, but specialized in one. He specialized in all the areas. He was what you would call, nowadays people would call that a, what's the expression? Someone who's a master of everything? A Renaissance man, right, that's the word I was looking for. But it didn't stop at scholarship. Both were passionate leaders and lovers of the Jewish people. They both had a passion for Jewish people, for their own people. Of course, they loved everyone. People who say, I love everyone equally, that's nonsense. You don't love your children the same way you love some total stranger. If you do, on the same level, then there's something wrong. You love your children more than you love a stranger, and that's the way it should be. But Rambam and Schneur Zalman consider the Jewish people their own children. That's the hallmark of the greatest of Jewish leaders, who were passionate and were willing to give their lives to help others. Both endured tremendous opposition, both from Gentile and Jewish sources. But a difference between them was with regard to Kabbalah, mysticism. There's a big debate among historians, Jewish historians, if Maimonides was exposed to the teachings of Kabbalah. Many people claim, most claim no. You don't see any trace of Kabbalah in his writings. Even when he refers to what the Talmud calls the act of creation, the act of the chariot, which sounds like Kabbalah, he interprets it to refer to philosophy. So most people would argue Maimonides was not a Kabbalist, and he may not even have known about Kabbalah. That I find very difficult to accept, because his predecessors, who lived hundreds of years before him, were great Kabbalists. So I'm sure he knew about Kabbalah. But was he himself steeped in those teachings? We certainly can't say for sure, although there's a belief in the Chassidic community, the belief is that he was a Kabbalist, but he hid it because the people of that time were not ready for mysticism. Where he lived, they were steeped in Aristotelian philosophy. Mysticism would have turned them off. So he hid that knowledge. But whatever opinion we follow, he certainly did not write any books on Kabbalah. There's no trace of his Kabbalistic writings, if he ever had them. Rabbi Schneur Zalman, on the other hand, was a master Kabbalist and was equally great in Talmud and Kabbalah, which differentiates him from Maimonides. And I think we covered the subject briefly. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute. If you're on Zoom, if you're not on Zoom, you don't have to unmute.
Excuse me. In the very beginning, you little bit touched the subject about soul move from one person to other.
Yeah. Reincarnation.
Reincarnation. Is it or not?
Yeah. We believe in reincarnation. Reincarnation is mentioned in the Zohar most prominently, and this is interestingly, the people have this erroneous view that the Gaon of Vilna, the opponent to Chassidus, was a rationalist, and he didn't like the mystical teachings of the Chassidim. The Gaon of Vilna was one of the greatest Kabbalists of all times. In fact, he wrote dozens of books, most of which are on Kabbalah. The Gaon of Vilna did not like Rambam's philosophical writings. He was anti-philosophy, the Gaon of Vilna. So the whole rift between Chassidim and the opponents, to say that it was based on Kabbalah, that the opponents didn't like Kabbalah, is not true. It's absolutely false. It's interpretation of the teachings of Kabbalah that were at the crux of their dispute. Interpreting certain things which the Gaon of Vilna had a different interpretation from Reb Schneur Zalman. And that's what it was a legitimate difference that had nothing to do with, it had something to do with the opposition, but that was the minor cause of the opposition.
And one more. You told about some rabbis.
I forgot to, I started off. The Gaon of Vilna takes the Book of Jonah and interprets the whole book as a metaphor for the soul coming into this world another time. That the whole book of Jonah is divided into two parts, and the Jonah is a metaphor for the soul. The soul comes into the world in different stages, in different times. The same soul in different bodies. So the Gaon of Vilna, who was the opponent of the Chassidic movement, was much more steeped in reincarnation than the Chassidic movement, actually. He puts much more emphasis on it. Yes, no.
You talk about Rabbi, some Rabbi Rabbi Kanevsky, yes?
I didn't mention any names.
I know. I know, I say this name.
Yes, he is a great scholar, a very pious, righteous man. He's a man who every year he goes through the entire Babylonian Talmud, Jerusalem Talmud, Maimonides, Code of Jewish Law, the Zohar. He studies it every year for the last 80 years. He's been going through it. He's a brilliant scholar, but he's 93 years old, I think, and he has people around him that give him information, and I'm not always sure that they give him the right information. Sometimes it's because they may have an agenda, and I'm not saying their agenda is bad, but he is not privy to the information about some major things that he should have known if they were really relying on his decisions.
Can you give an example of what Kabbalism is?
You want me to turn you into a frog?
Yes.
Kabbalah is a very broad subject. It deals with divine, spiritual worlds. It deals with angels. It deals with the soul. But it's written in a code. That's the difference between Kabbalah mysticism and Chassidic mysticism. There are very many similarities, but there are also major differences. While Kabbalah was written in a coded language, well, it would talk about different spiritual energies intermingling, and will use sexual imagery for that. And if anyone translates it, interprets it literally, they're distorting the meaning. It was written in code so that only people who are initiates into this teaching would understand it. The Chassidic mysticism does the opposite. It strips the code from its cover and gives you the soul of the teaching. But anything that deals with God, God's relationship with the world, God's attributes, the world's different levels of spiritual consciousness, as I said before, the angels, these are all subjects in Kabbalah. And Kabbalah is a very large genre. There I don't know how many I have in my computer, probably about 500 volumes on Kabbalah. And there's probably a lot more.
But can you believe Kabbalah?
Yes, Kabbalah is part of Judaism. It's part of Torah. It's not controversial. What's controversial about Kabbalah is how to interpret it, and also to who should study it. There was a time where there was a ban placed on people under the age of 40. Under the age of 40, you shouldn't study Kabbalah. Why? Because it can be easily misinterpreted, distorted. That's what Shabtai Tzvi did. He took teachings of Kabbalah. He was aware of these teachings, and he distorted them. So Kabbalah could be very dangerous to the wrong person if it's not taught the right way. And but Kabbalah itself is universally accepted as part of Judaism, part of Torah, even those who are opposed to the teaching of Kabbalah. Any other question? Any the zoomies, zombies? Some faces I could see, but some I can't. So. Let me see
Rabbi,
the chat.
thank you. Have a good day, and everybody.
Thank you.